Let me try from the first to indicate the point. The point is this: human consciousness is at the same time as being a form of awareness and sensitivity and understanding, it's also a form of ignorance.
We spend our days narrating ourselves to ourselves. A private cinema runs in our heads. We rehearse conversations, jump cut to memories, imagine futures, argue with invisible audiences. Most of us take that constant narration for granted. We hardly ever stop to ask where it comes from. In The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, Julian Jaynes poses a radical question. What if that inner movie isn't universal? What if it's slowly emerged, and only relatively recently? And what were humans like before that? They were all schizophrenic, or at least guided by voices. That is the outrageous conclusion Jaynes comes to. I know that sounds absolutely crazy, and it very well might be. But if he's right, it completely changes how we read history, myth, and even religion. I'm serious when I say this theory is truly out there, and yet Jaynes makes a shockingly good case for it, and I think you'll see why. Before we dive into the deep end, let's get an understanding of what Jaynes even means by consciousness. It's a slippery word. For Jaynes, consciousness isn't just being awake. It's not the raw experience of seeing the colour red or feeling pain. He means the imagined inner stage where we talk to ourselves, rehearse moves, and picture outcomes, a mind space with an I moving around inside it. Not a thing in the brain, but a model the brain builds with language and metaphor. It's the voice in your head that's narrating even as you listen to this video. The one that says, I am me. Crucially, he says most of what we do never needs that inner stage. You can drive a familiar road, tie a knot, reach for a glass of water, all without narrating it. Consciousness isn't what drives our actions. It's a simulator we consult when the road forks or the stakes rise. Jaynes argues that this kind of consciousness is a surprisingly recent invention. He points to one of the cornerstones of Western literature to make his case: Homer's Iliad. In the Iliad you'll find plenty of action. Warriors rage, clash and die. But what you won't find, according to Jaynes, is anyone thinking for themselves. There's no introspection, no agonising over choices, no sense of a private inner world. When a hero in the Iliad needs to make a decision, he doesn't weigh the pros and cons. A god appears and tells him what to do, not as a metaphor, not as a feeling, as a voice in his head. Take Achilles. When he's about to draw his sword on Agamemnon, the goddess Athena literally grabs him by the hair and tells him to temper his rage. And he does, without question. Jaynes says this isn't just a literary device, it's a window into a different kind of human mind, a mind he calls bicameral. The bicameral mind is, as the name suggests, a mind of two chambers. One chamber, the man side, goes about its daily business. The other chamber, the God side, is the source of those divine commands. In moments of stress or novelty, when habit and instinct weren't enough, the God side would speak, guiding the man side's actions. These voices weren't figments of the imagination. They were experienced as real, authoritative, and as divine. So where did these voices come from? Jaynes suggests they were a kind of auditory hallucination, a remnant of a time when the two hemispheres of our brain were communicating less smoothly than they are today. The right hemisphere, the more creative and holistic side, would generate the voices, which the left hemisphere, the more logical and language-focused side, would interpret as commands from the gods. This bicameral mind, Jaynes argues, was the engine of civilization for thousands of years. It built the pyramids, it wrote the first laws, it created the great empires of the ancient world. But it couldn't last. The world was changing, societies were growing more complex, and the voices of the gods began to fall silent. This silence, this breakdown of the bicameral mind, is where our consciousness truly begins. Imagine a symphony orchestra where every musician has their part perfectly memorized. It works flawlessly, as long as the score never changes. Now imagine a catastrophe strikes, a fire, an earthquake, a flood. The old score is useless. The musicians need to improvise, to adapt, to create something new. This is what happened to the human mind during the Late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. A wave of chaos swept across the ancient world. Civilizations that had stood for centuries collapsed. The Egyptians called it the invasion of the sea peoples. Cities were burned, trade routes were severed, and entire populations were uprooted and sent wandering as refugees. The old certainties vanished. But why? Jaynes says the bicameral mind, which relied on the stable, repeated admonitions of a king or a god, do this, go there, was suddenly overwhelmed. The old divine commands were no longer adequate for this new, terrifyingly complex world. The voices sputtered, offered conflicting advice, or fell silent altogether. At the same time, a new technology was spreading, one that would fundamentally rewire the human brain: writing. Before writing, authority was auditory. The command of a king or a god was a thing you heard. But writing fossilized that command. It made it external, permanent, and silent. You no longer needed to hear the voice of the God King when his laws were carved in stone for all to see. So what happens when the gods stop talking? Humanity entered a period of profound crisis. You can see it in the historical record. As the inner voices faded, people began desperately searching for them in the outside world. This is the age of oracles, divination, and idols. Think about the oracle at Delphi. A priestess would enter a trance and babble incoherently, and priests would interpret her words as the will of the god Apollo. People would travel for miles, desperate for the kind of divine guidance that their ancestors had simply heard in their heads. They tried to read the will of the gods in the flight of birds, in the entrails of sacrificed animals, in the patterns of smoke. They built statues, idols, and prayed to them, hoping these stone figures would speak just as the voices in their minds once did. Again, Jaynes traces this transition in the evolution of literature. We already saw how the characters in the Iliad were bicameral automatons. But just a century or two later, we get the Odyssey. And its hero, Odysseus, is a new kind of human. He's described as a man of many turns. He is cunning, he is deceptive, he lies, he schemes. Most importantly, he has a rich inner life. He makes plans, he weighs options, and he motivates himself with internal monologues. When he's tempted to reveal his identity, he tells his own heart, "Endure, my heart, you have endured worse than this." That's not a god speaking to him. That is the nascent voice of consciousness. We see the same story in the Old Testament. The earliest books are filled with direct conversations with God. God speaks to Abraham and Moses as one man speaks to another, but as you move forward in time, God becomes more and more distant. By the time of the prophets, hearing the voice of God is a rare and terrifying event, something that only happens to a chosen few. The prophet Amos asks, "The lion has roared. Who will not fear? The Lord God has spoken. Who can but prophesy?" Hearing the voice of God has gone from being a normal part of human mentality to a shocking, world-shattering experience. The rest of humanity was left to navigate a silent world, armed only with written laws and a new, flickering internal space. This was the birth of introspection, the birth of the self. In the silence left by the gods, we had to create a new kind of guidance. Jaynes points to much more evidence in his book, and I encourage everyone to read it. But I think you get the general idea. We learn to narrate our own lives, to give ourselves advice, to become our own gods. The breakdown was complete. Humanity was now conscious, and in doing so, became anxious, nostalgic, and forever haunted by the memory of the voices it had lost. Our modern consciousness feels total. The voice in your head, the one narrating your life, feels like the captain of the ship. It feels like you. But Jaynes argues this narrator is more like a frantic press secretary, trying to make sense of decisions that have already been made in older, deeper parts of the brain. And sometimes the old machinery whirs back to life and something else speaks. The most obvious echo of the bicameral mind is religion. Think of the core concept of a personal God, a being who listens to your thoughts and, if you're lucky, speaks back to you. Prayer is essentially a conscious attempt to elicit a bicameral voice. The stories of prophets, saints, and mystics who hear the direct word of God, like Joan of Arc hearing the voices of angels commanding her to lead an army, are stories of a temporary return to a bicameral state. We built entire global belief systems out of a deep collective nostalgia for the certainty of the lost voices. We can also see a tamer version of this in art and music. Where does creativity come from? Ask a poet, and she might talk about the muse. Ask a musician, and he might say a melody just came to him. This feeling of inspiration as something received rather than created is a faint echo of the bicameral voice. It's the non-verbal right hemisphere of the brain passing a fully formed idea to the language-based left hemisphere. It's the ghost of the god, now offering a poem instead of a command. But the ghost isn't always so gentle. This is where Jaynes's theory becomes its most controversial and perhaps its most profound. He turns his attention to schizophrenia. The primary symptom for many schizophrenics is auditory hallucination, hearing voices that are not their own, which often give commands. Our modern world sees this as a tragic dysfunction, a brain misfiring. Jaynes asks, what if it isn't a malfunction, but the re-emergence of an ancient function in a world that no longer understands it? What if the schizophrenic is hearing the same kind of voice a bicameral man heard? For the ancient Greek warrior, that voice was Athena, and obeying it was natural. For the modern office worker, with no cultural framework of gods and spirits, that same voice is an alien, terrifying intrusion. It's a signal from an obsolete system, received without the software needed to decode it. So, where does this leave us? According to Jaynes, consciousness is not a biological inevitability that's simply switched on one day. It is a fragile, learned, and culturally taught solution to the problem of the silent gods. That private movie running in your head is a tool we invented to navigate the deafening silence. Jaynes's theory is truly out there, yet magnificent, and probably in many ways wrong. But its power isn't in its literal truth. Its power is that it shakes the very foundation of what we think we are. It suggests that the self, your I, is not the master of the house, but a recent and anxious tenant, living in a structure built for someone or something else. And that sometimes, on the quietest nights, you can still hear the whispers of the old landlord.